Hi, so we're going to do something a little bit different today. I'm going to start off this week with just a review of critical concepts. So we had the midterm review last week, but I wanted to make sure that you guys really understood these key concepts. So some of you have expressed interest in taking future behavior analytic coursework, and these are some things that you're going to need to be able to understand, or you're going to need to have a solid understanding of to move forward in those classes. Likewise, you're going to need to have an understanding of these concepts to succeed in the second half of this class. So we've got a few more weeks of instruction. We've got, after this week, we have 5 more weeks and then the final. So, I want to make sure that you guys have the opportunity to really get the knowledge and practice the knowledge that you already, or that of things that we've already gone over that are crucial for your success. So I'll stop going on about why this is important and go ahead and just give you a quick rundown of some of the really important concepts that I'd like for you to make sure you understand. So the first concept is a stimulus class. This exists not in contrast with a response class, but there seems to be a lot of confusion around the difference between a stimulus class and a response class. So a stimulus class is going to be a set of stimuli. So those are perceptible objects or things in the environment. So if you see a group of things, they might belong to a stimulus class. They share at least one of the following: a formal feature, so something like color, shape, size, etc. A temporal locus, so their antecedents or their consequences, or the function, which means they serve as either a discriminative stimulus or an S delta. So a stimulus class, really important. Stimulus means a perceptible object in the environment. So if it's a perceptible object in the environment, then that's going to be a stimulus class. Remember here that a response or an individual engaging in a behavior, while the individual could be considered a perceptible thing or an object in the environment, and so could the behavior. Typically, if you see it as a class, it's going to be a stimulus class. Now, of course, use your judgment to think about this one. Some examples of stimulus classes: shades of the same color. So we had, I believe on the midterm, we had an example with different shades of pink. And those would all belong to the stimulus class pink, right? And then there are different types of keys. Those are all antecedent stimuli that evoke a similar or the same response, which would be grabbing the item and putting it into a lock and turning it. That putting it into a lock and turning it, those would all be a response class, because you might put it into a lock like this, you might put it into a lock like this. There are different kinds of keys you would put into different locks. If you have a little padlock, you might do it slightly differently, but those would all result in the same reinforcer, which would be unlocking of a lock. So we're going to take a look at response classes next. I got a little bit ahead of myself there. So response class is a group of behaviors. So behaviors and response, those are very similar in meaning. Response class is a group of behaviors that produce the same effect on the environment, share a physical dimension, or are sensitive to the same reinforcement or punishment. So that would tell you that they typically have the same function. So the responses, behaviors have to be done by a living organism, right? A bunch of colors cannot be a response. I guess you could say saying the colors might be a response, but the colors themselves would not be a response. They would only be stimuli. And they're commonly used for behaviors with a similar effect on the environment, so that result in the same thing. So if we had an individual who engaged in multiple topographies of a behavior to get the same effect, for example, if hitting their peers, running around the classroom and screaming like a banshee, and breaking pencils all resulted in getting sent out of class to the social worker's office where they get a tasty snack, those behaviors, although they look very different, would belong to the same response class. So examples: hand raising, that's going to be a response class, right? You can raise your hand like this, you can raise your hand like this, you can raise your hand like this. Those all share a physical dimension, and they likely all have a similar effect on the environment. I know that I don't discriminate based on how you're raising your hand. As a matter of fact, maybe wiggling would get my attention faster because it's moving. But typically, they have the same effect. And then using a key, like we talked about, that has the same effect on the environment, regardless of the movement required. So whichever way you turn the key in the lock, that's going to have the same effect, resulting in that lock being unlocked. And even in a car, that's, the lock on the ignition switch that's open, so you're able to move on from that. Okay, so then we have discrimination training, and this is often confused with differential reinforcement. So my advice to you would be to go ahead and just save these slides. Use them as part of your study packet as you get ready for the final. I know we just had our midterm, but it's always good to be thinking forward, and this time's going to go so quickly. So discrimination training is where behavior is reinforced in the presence of a stimulus, but not in its absence. So then the stimulus where the behavior is reinforced, the stimulus that's present when the behavior is reinforced, is going to become an SD, or a discriminative stimulus. The stimuli where it is, or the stimulus conditions where it's not reinforced, would become the S delta. And discrimination training establishes stimulus control. And this is where we see a change in the rate of behavior based on the stimulus conditions. So for example, raising your hand is likely under stimulus control of the stimuli in the classroom, of being in a classroom. So an instructor present, possibly particular seating configurations, different things might evoke those behaviors, right? But you are unlikely to do that sitting at home, where the presence of the dining room table and your significant other or friends or roommates or whoever you live with would serve as S deltas for raising your hand, and possibly SDs for punishment of raising your hand in the form of some mild derision. So again, the presence or the absence of a specific stimulus results in a change in the rate of behavior. When we see that, we say that the behavior is under stimulus control of whatever stimulus it is. So for example, hand raising is under stimulus control of the presence of an instructor. Other examples, so you answer your phone when it rings, you make that movement to answer the phone. So typically we're swiping, now we're pressing a button. When it rings, that's the discriminative stimulus for that movement. Similarly, a phone that's not lit up, that's an S delta for that movement. You don't swipe across your phone to answer the phone. Of course, now we have the same gesture serving multiple functions, and we'll get into some of that a little later. Halloween is coming up. That is another example of stimulus control. Hopefully you only knock on doors with the porch light on and not on doors with the porch light off, right? So the presence of a light would be an SD for reinforcement for knocking, and a light being off would be an S delta for reinforcement, possibly an SD for punishment, if you were to be met with a cranky person who was upset that you had ignored their porch light. And rightly cranky. So then we also have differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement is where one response or response class gets reinforced. So reinforcement starts with an R, response starts with an R. That's something that you could use to help you remember that. So a particular response or another response class, context reinforcement, and other responses and other response classes do not contact reinforcement. So they may be on extinction if there is a history of reinforcement of those responses in the past. So again, back to our raising hands. Raising a hand in school is going to be reinforced, but shouting out is not reinforced, hopefully. Ordering Starbucks at a coffee is going to be reinforced. Ordering those tacos that we talked about at that Starbucks is probably not going to be reinforced unless you get a lot of attention from the baristas, right? And that increases the rate of you ordering tacos in a restaurant, and then it could just be your little dad joke. So again, these are all predictions. Typically, this is the way I would expect it to go, but you never know. And we have to remember that what determines whether something is reinforcement or not is not whether or not the person intends for it to be reinforcing, but whether or not we see that change in the future frequency of the behavior. So let's take a minute to talk about these terms again, because I was still seeing them misused a little bit, and I know most of you have this, but it never hurts to review. So reinforcement has to increase the rate of behavior under similar circumstances. And now you know that those circumstances include things like the stimulus conditions. So the presence of a particular SD might increase the rate of behavior might only increase under the presence of a particular SD. Punishment has to decrease the rate of a behavior under similar circumstances. So again, we now know about SDs for punishment. Those are going to be part of those similar circumstances that we see that would evoke that decrease in the rate of behavior. Negative just means a stimulus is removed from the environment. So a stimulus is anything that an organism can perceive with any of its sense receptors. So it's eyes, ears, nose, mouth, skin. So a stimulus is removed from the environment, it's negative. A stimulus is added to the environment, it's positive. So none of these terms have the connotation of good or bad. And I think that's really hard for some early behavior analysis students to set aside. but please do just try to put that connotation, your previous history with these behaviors or with these terms aside, so that you can learn to use them correctly. I think if you were to take a survey of behavior analysts of things that frustrate us, it's hearing negative reinforcement used to mean an attempt at a punishment procedure. All right, so that wraps it up for those terms. I hope that was helpful. I would encourage you to watch this video a couple of times, maybe come back to it whenever we have our, whenever you're getting ready for your final, just to make sure you've still got a grasp of these. And I do appreciate your time and attention. We'll get on to today's topics in the next video. All right, thanks so much. Bye.